Welcome again. Today we will be discussing olive oil and soap. We will speak about Ayvalık, Mytilene, Istanbul.
Mediterranean olive oil, lighting, cooking, perfuming. Çalışmıyor mu? Öyle mi? Yapma bunu. Tamam. Both basins of the Mediterranean constitute an olive production area, with olive oil a staple food in the Mediterranean trilogy of bread, wine, and oil, and today a must-eat part of the Mediterranean diet. Yet, during antiquity and the Byzantine era, olive oil, almost a luxury item, was mainly used in worship, medicine, hygiene, grooming, and later for lighting and food, as historians of the age reveal. During Ottoman times, and focusing on the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, as far as I know from the research I have been following, the picture of organization and operation in the area mainly involved in olive cultivation and the use of oil was not always presented like the one we were shown today. Historical studies observing the Eastern Mediterranean from Crete to Peloponnese and the Sea of Marmara, or from Gallipoli to Syria, reveal the complex game played around the olive by the climate, long-term ownership, political power, the laws of supply and demand at a local and international level, demography, the regulatory words of the Orthodox Church, of dietetics, of medicine, technical delays, etc. At the same time, ethnologists play an exceptional part in research into traditional olive cultivation pre-industrial farming, and in the role of oil in nutrition, medicine, and gastronomy. And of course, there is the extremely dynamic presence of museology. Architects restore old buildings so they can be used again for cultural activities. Archaeologists propose organizing open museums, and educators present the results of modern educational programs in workplaces. Dear friends, dear friends, I have tried very briefly Dear friends, I have tried very briefly to portray the picture of research conducted up to now in Greece on oil and soap, and I am delighted that my friend Emine Naskali, professor at Marmara University, has announced she is preparing a volume on oil and is seeking contributions. Such a volume is indeed missing in Turkish bibliography. In Greece, international symposia have been held on the olive and oil, and superb volumes have been released containing studies by archaeologists, historians, economists, ethnologists, architects, and museologists who have worked together to create oil and soap making museums. Yet another volume has been awaiting publication for some time, but I believe it will two will soon be released. 11 years ago, today's panel, in a somewhat larger form, went to Italy to speak about the oil and soap making that developed on both shores of the northeastern Aegean with one of our hostess, Midilin-born Evridiki Sifnaios. Mrs. Sifnaios is a research director in the National Hellenic Research Foundation, and her interests, as referred to in her CV, focus on the economic and social history of the Eastern Mediterranean and the history of the Greek diaspora. She was worked to promote the industrial heritage of her birthplace, to revive oil mills and soap factories, and has written numerous studies on the subject. One of her books, Soap Making in Lesbos, a Memento, was published in 2002 in collaboration with an ex-minister, Nikos Sifounakis. She is with us today to present oil production and the processing of oil products in the single economic and cultural area of Ayvalık and Midilli. She will speak to us about the wealth accumulated from oil and its derivatives by the people in this corner of the world in the late Ottoman Empire, wealth that left its mark on both sides of the Aegean. Wonderful, majestic houses saved from the onslaught of the apartment block, as well as magnificent monuments, bear witness on the economic and cultural prosperity of the region. Our second guest is Mehmet Genç, one of the internationally acclaimed historians of economic history in the Ottoman Empire. He is one of the few examples of academics who, alongside his involvement with his academic field, has accumulated a vast amount of knowledge on subjects ranging from philosophy and literature to classical music, confessing us to a special penchant for Wagner. Mehmet, in an article of his translated in Greek after the Junta 1974, guided some historians of my generation in their academic choices. I was delighted and moved 30 years ago when, on first entering the Ottoman archives to work, I came across him, hunched over the documents. We have been friends ever since then, and I owe a great deal to his wisdom. 30 years of firm friendship. An untiring researcher of Ottoman sources, a bookworm second to none. He is familiar with sources and historiographical trends in all fields of Ottoman history, and he has a particularly keen interest to the theory and philosophy of history. He is very knowledgeable about the financial mechanism on the Ottoman Empire, and his work provides a strong reference points for all Ottomanists. I invited him to talk to us about supplying Istanbul with olive oil during the final centuries on the Ottoman Empire. This topic is being explored for the first time, and Mehmet Genç is the most competent and suitable person to do so. He will speak first, as I am sure that he has to say will help us to better understand how wealth accumulated in Midilli and Ayvalık. Mehmet, you have the floor for 25 minutes. Discussion, as always, will take place after the second lecture. Buyurun.
I would like to greet you all, and I will be seated while speaking.
Metne bakarak söyleyeceğim çünkü tercüme
We'll be looking at the text because we needed to provide the interpreter with the text, so I may risk telling other things if I do not adhere to the text, so I will try to make my speech by adhering to my text. I will speak about the olive oil and soap trading with its main lines in 18th, 19th century in Ottoman Istanbul. Well, before speaking the place of olive oil and soap trading in Istanbul, we should be speaking about the place and function of Istanbul in the Ottoman world. Because without making clear the properties of Istanbul within the economic system of Ottoman, we cannot speak about its trade potential in terms of any commodity. For that reason, first of all, we need to speak about the Ottoman economy system and the exceptional position of Istanbul within this system. Ottoman economic system started to emerge as of 16th century, and it maintained its profile up until 19th century. Well, the Ottoman administration mindset was comprising of meeting the requirements of the society and the state with all its layers, and they took actions based on a couple of fundamental principles while regulating the economic life. The very first principle was provisionism, and accordingly the purpose of economic activity was to provide the supply of goods and services in the most abundant quality and cheapest way possible. The producers of the goods and services had to meet their requirements first, then they needed to respond to the needs of the society. It was actually very difficult to increase the efficiency, and in order to respond to the requirements of provisionism, they had to start from agriculture to tradesmen and trading, and they built a very comprehensive world of regulations starting from agriculture. And they thought that the most efficient production could be possible with the small-scale family enterprises. The Ottoman Empire allocated a land of 60 to 150 decars of land according to the efficiency of the land, and the ownership of the agricultural lands were not allocated to the individuals. It would be kept by the state on behalf of Beytul Mal, which means Islamic State, and accordingly they could prevent partitioning of the enterprise because of inheritance, and thereby it could be inherited from father to son without any partitioning. And the state also regulated the transfer of the lands between individuals according to its approval, and the state wouldn't also allow the people to desert their lands or to halt operating or processing the lands without the approval of the state. These ideal regulations were valid in the majority of Asia and Europe, and they believed that they could maximize the production in this way. And the actual place where they thought the needs would be balanced was the township, which we call a district now. And in the center of the township, there was a population of 3,000 to 20,000. And there were villages under it as low as 20, 30 or as high as 300 villages, and this narrow space was comprising of 500 to 3,000 kilometers square meter, and it was under the control of a Qadi who was equipped with very broad authorizations, and it was the fundamental unit in terms of the financial and administrative aspects. The products from agriculture was responding to the needs of the group which was comprising of the tradesmen, and this way they could meet the requirements. None of the agricultural or industrial properties manufactured in the territory was allowed to be taken out of this territory before meeting the needs of this township first. After meeting the needs of the township, if any commodities left, then they would be sent to Istanbul first, and of course to the government and military in Istanbul first. If anything is left, then it would be taken to the other territories of the empire. For example, for a township to send any goods to the adjacent township, it had to ask for the permission of Istanbul first. After meeting the needs of these levels, I mean the needs of the township and the needs of the Istanbul are met first. If anything is left, then they can take it to the other territories, and if there is still any product, then they could export it upon the approval of the state as well. The leftovers after meeting the needs of the country would be exported upon the approval of the state, as we said. And export was not the objective of production in the Ottoman economy understanding, which was based on provisionism. The objective was to meet the needs, and the export would be possible once the needs of the country are met. So it means it's marginal benefit was almost zero for the country. The state attempted to impose the tightest intervention possible in this field, and they would monitor how much commodity would be exported, and there was also a customs duty which was increased by time. On the other hand, import was free because they assumed that products that were needed by the country would be imported into the country. While making economic decisions, the second principle they took into consideration was fiscalism, and the incomes of the treasury would be increased as much as possible. And in order to increase it, the production capacity and the monetary exchange volume was very important. So it was very difficult to increase the efficiency and therefore the production. Also, transportation was very expensive, so the monetary exchange was very limited within the Ottoman economy. And adoption of provisionism as a principle was stemming from the fact that they thought the maximum wealth could not be ensured in any other way possible. But as they continued to depend on provisionism, the risk and cost of changing those conditions were very high. And as a result, provisionism and the conditions in its root tended to last for a very long time by supporting each other mutually. And Istanbul was not only the administration center of the empire with its economic system, but it was also the economic and financial center of the empire with these regulations. The agricultural and the industrial properties would be produced in all parts of empire, and the excess products would be directed to Istanbul as an obligation, and it was a financial center which was accumulating the leftovers of the commodities. So the abundance of goods and money facilitated the population in Istanbul to increase in a conscious and planned way. The most optimistic forecasts about the population of Istanbul when it was joined in the empire was 50,000, but almost 100 years later, Istanbul did not only become the largest city and the most crowded city of empire, but also Mediterranean and European world. And of course, this big center needed various agricultural and industrial goods, and they had understood with their experiences how much or in what way they would be meeting the needs of this big center, and as a result a pattern occurred, and the factors that forced this pattern to change emerged from time to time, and in case they emerged, the patterns took shape in a different way depending on these factors being temporary or permanent. And for example, more than 90% of the grains that Istanbul needed would come from northern West Black Sea and Tuna regions. The inputs of the candle used in lighting, for example, the animals' fat, would also come from the same region. And if there was any temporary change in that region, they would refer to another territory or region, but when it was restored, they would continue with the same pattern as well. And the massive substances such as wood, coal, and timber would come from Black Sea as well. So, in short, they knew how much they would pick these goods and from which region. Also, it was known who would bring, when they would bring, and which way they would bring. Of course, there were changes according to its place, according to its type and cost, but the fundamental structure in the Ottoman system was assuming to supply it from the tradesmen in the private industry, but not in the public industry. And they were trying to provide them as cheap as possible. The direct intervention of the state was also possible when it was needed and when it was obligatory. So they attempted to provide these materials with the lowest cost possible. So the tradesmen would also be given a very slight profit so that they could maintain their operations. The objective was to ensure a balance between the producers, sellers, and consumers, and without enriching against each other or without going to poverty, they would continue living. Olive oil and soap need of Istanbul would come from both sides of Aegean and from the islands. It was also fundamental to provide these materials with the lowest cost possible, depending on their production capacities or their proximity to Istanbul. The goods produced within the empire would be exported once the requirements of the home country were met, as I said before. If there is any good that had to be, that could not suffice the requirements of the empire, they would be banned from export. For example, wheat, cotton, cotton yarn, cotton dress, processed leather, or other industrial products were subject to export prohibition regime. And olive oil was not banned from exports in this category. As much as production was sufficient, they would allow to export it. And if there is any surplus, they would also allow to export it. They prohibited goods meant a property which could not be exported abroad, and the rest, including olive oil, could be exportable as long as they are not prohibited. The olive oil could be exported with a tax set in the tariffs based on the treaties, but if the production is lower at home or if there is an excessive demand from the other countries and if that causes deterioration of the home balance, the internal demand, then they could have imposed permanent prohibitions. This first happened in 1709 when the severe cold weather conditions devastated the olive trees in the western part of Mediterranean, and there was a huge external demand, and for that reason, the Ottoman authorities had to intervene the market, and they had to limit the external demand, and they imposed 100% tax on export of oil. They wanted to control the export in this way. And the price of olive oil was doubled, and it was not possible to export it anymore. In Aegean region, olive oil was the main source for survival of the people, and the people in islands such as Crete or Mytilene were living on olive oil, and it was not possible to consume the entire production inside the island. So the state decided to impose an reasonable additional tax on export of olive oil for the very first time in its history. It was called resmi miri or bidat, as cited from the Western sources, and it was described as 3% in the treaties for all the countries, but a new tax up to 20 to 30% of the price was implemented starting from 1720s. And this export tax decreased the price of olive oil inside the empire, and the external demand was lowered, and with a protective impact, the soap production was protected and developed. After 1720 or 1730s, many soap producers started to work, and this new tax regime was adopted for many other commodities which had the capacity to exceed the needs. For example, it was adopted for cotton, cotton yarn, processed leather, tobacco, and other commodities. These new taxes were also a new source of income for the revenue office, and they only took these taxes from the export. During 7 Years' War in Europe between 1756 and 1763, production started to decrease, and this income resource could not be sacrificed by the Ottoman fiscalism, and that's when they imposed a tax on the olive oil which was sold in the domestic market. So that increased the price of the olive oil, and therefore the protective impact on soap production was also eliminated. And following that period, the olive oils used by the soup producers were also subjected to tax. The important problem in these years, the fact that the wars that started at the beginning of 1760 and lasted for 70 years resulted in defeats. And starting from 19th century, the civil wars were also added, and that caused a very long-term crisis, actually a chain of crises. And this crisis impacted the trading and exchange as well, and that caused a very huge inflation which was not seen in the Ottoman history before, and the prices were doubled in 10 to 15 years. This is actually very small for the inflation we have currently. A third factor that caused increase in the olive oil price was the increase of external demand starting from 1770s, and olive oil and soap that was needed by Istanbul could not be found, and it was obligatory to restrict the export from the territories that were sending olive oil and soap to Istanbul, and they were not allowed to export these products as long as they do not send the need of Istanbul. And the export prohibitions in Mytilene Edremit was renewed again and again, and the tax on export was also increased with additions, and they had different names. Despite increasing the taxes and despite the prohibitions, it was not possible to meet the need of Istanbul in terms of soap and olive oil. As a result, the state attempted to manage the olive oil trading with a method known Yed-i Vahid. It is called monopoly with today's language. It was not a complete monopoly. It was actually a partial monopoly which was executed by the tradesmen that were allowed by the state. This new practice was also not successful. The people started to complain because of their problems, and this application was also ended in 1834, provided that they committed to send the olive oil and soap needed by Istanbul. And the olive oil and soap were subject to new additional taxes for export, and trading was liberalized under these circumstances. The objective was to meet the increasing olive oil and soap need of Istanbul, and also to provide this at an affordable price. For that reason, the producers and the merchants were given a very slight profit over the olive oil and soap they were selling in Istanbul. The inflation was between 5 to 10%, of course, but the profit was also less than 10%. And that slight profit could have turned into a loss in a very short time. So, despite all the commitments, the merchants and the producers, including those who had to come to Istanbul, tried to take away the commodities they brought to Istanbul. And the objective to create an affordable island in Istanbul was not possible. Following the Tanzimat period, the prices in empire were liberalized depending on supply and demand, and they were integrated to a certain extent, and these problems were partially solved, we can say. That's all from my side. It is the very first time I have read a text in order to help our interpreter, so I would like to apologize once again, and I would like to greet all respectfully. Well, thank you for this speech, because you have given us a text, and you have been very successful in this. It was a very important study for us, and thank you for this comprehensive speech. We would like to thank you. Now we will continue with our next speaker.
Ναι, αυτή πρέπει πρώτα να ανοίξει το projector και μετά να ανοίξει.
Να κλείσω τον υπολογιστή. Να το κλείσω.
Εντάξει, το ανοίξει.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the General Consulate of Greece for the invitation and all the audience that has come here to listen. To these talks on the Mediterranean culinary habits organized by the National Hellenic Research Foundation and coordinated by Professor Evangelia Balta. And I would like to thank you all. It is always a great pleasure for Greek researchers to be here. Okay. So let us see if it's going to work this time. Now, Professor Genç has highlighted the importance of Istanbul in provisioning olive oil and soap. So I'm going to talk on the importance of the olive oil culture on both sides of the Aegean. So, in the 19th century, the economy of Lesbos and let's see, let's cut it off. So the economy of Lesbos and of the facing coast of Asia Minor was based on the cultivation of the olive. Expertise in the cultivation of olive trees and production of olive oil and soap created a common cultural heritage that affected the residents of both regions on a daily basis and determined their migratory movements. The implicit mastery of oleoculture and the beneficial uses of olive oil in the culinary practices constituted a cultural resource that has passed from generation to generation and traveled with the inhabitants of the Aegean from America to Egypt, South Africa, and Australia. From this point of view, we could describe it as a peripatetic cultural resource. The peripatetic school of the ancient Greeks walked and philosophized. Knowledge of the economics of the olive not only accompanied these people, but helped them ensure a living. On the 1st of September 1907, Vasilios Goutos, olive oil merchant from Mytilene, shipped a gift of 20 quails he had shot that very day at dawn to his friend, the headmaster of the Ivalik Gymnasium. During the day, he received 200 clams freshly harvested from the bottom of the sea from Michael Kazazis, an olive oil press owner in Edremit. In the afternoon, after a walk in town, he turned his attention once again to his correspondence with landowners, merchants, and businessmen from the opposite coast. He caught up on weather conditions for the past few days, forecasts for the upcoming olive harvest, the cost of renting warehouses, and the reason for the delay in his order from the factory of Dimitrios Isigonis of Izmir, of the new mechanized olive press and soap factory he planned to operate in November. Later that evening, having completed his business correspondence, he attended a performance in town of an Athenian theater company just returning from successful engagements in Ayvalık. This snapshot of a typical day in the life of a merchant at the beginning of the 20th century demonstrates the intensive frequency of the communications between the two shores prior to the closing off of the maritime channel by the borders of ethnically defined nations. The ease of exchanging personal goods that were so perishable that they had to be consumed or cooked on the same day clearly indicates how busy the maritime network of scheduled and unscheduled itineraries of motorboats, dinghies, and small capacity steamships was between the two coasts. This modest microhistorical example shows how close the two economies, based on the olive and soap, were. The level of exchange of correspondence and information extended also to raw materials, money packages, personnel, seasonal workers, and prospective grooms for marriage. The last might seem puzzling, and so I'll explain it immediately. Many of the farmers on the east coast of Lesbos worked on the chief leeks of medium-sized estates of Asia Minor during the off-season for olive cultivation, that is, between May and October. In the archives of the Ecclesiastic Court of Mytilene, we find many suits filed to cancel contracts of engagement that resulted from the prospective groom's long-term absence in Asia Minor, where one can suggest that he had settled and possibly even married. Now let's return, however, to the interdependence of Lesbos economy with Asia Minors. From the end of the 19th century on, Lesbos experienced an unprecedented level of industrial development. Most of the establishments were mechanized. The olive presses and soap factories worked uninterruptedly during olive harvest time and well into March. They supplied the markets of the cities and towns of Asia Minor, from Izmit on the Sea of Marmara to Bodrum in the South Aegean coast. High demand for Istanbul and Asia Minor pressured the landowners of Lesbos to replace animal-driven olive mills with high-capacity steam-operated presses, such as the one owned by the commune of the town of Agia Paraskevy. The communal olive press, called the People's Machine, as it was known, was founded in 1910 following a decision by the Greek Orthodox community and with donations raised from the approximately 180 local villages who had emigrated to England, America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. The factory was equipped with 2 mill processors and 4 hydraulic presses, and the machinery had been manufactured in Izmir. Its success resulted from the fact that its profits were earmarked for philanthropic and educational purposes. For this reason, many of the village cultivators preferred to have their olives ground at the communal factory rather than at private-owned mills. The construction of the village's new and rather majestic public school, which was completed in 1929, was paid with the profits from the olive factory. Until 1912, the olive oil-based economies on both sides of the Aegean and the shared geographic, political, and administrative landscape ensured intensive exchange of products and interdependent economic development. The olive oil and soap industries in Lesvos would never have expanded as dramatically as they did in the early 20th century if the raw materials and multiple inland markets of Asia Minor hadn't been available. Kernels were imported for olive kernel oil plants, soap scraps for glycerin factories, pergamon cotton for the Athanasiadis textile mill, coal from Zonguldak and Eregli for the steam-powered factories. This catalogue of raw materials was supplemented by pine bark for the tanneries and sarmusak, pink-colored stone, and lumber for the booming construction trades. Most imported products from Europe arrived and were stored in the warehouses of the port of Mytilene before being shipped on to Ayvalık. Prior to 1882, dredging of the port of Ayvalık, which permitted ships of mid-range capacity to dock there, the large steamship companies only stopped in Mytilene, and the products of the import market were distributed from there to the coast of Asia Minor. In the 19th century, the absence of road and railroad networks connecting the smaller municipalities of Asia Minor to the commercial centers of Izmir, Bursa, and Istanbul meant that maritime transportation was the most inexpensive, in fact, the principal method for transporting goods. Lesvos was the most accessible commercial and industrial center serving the broader Ayvalık and Edremit region. The commercial development and industrial expansion of the olive oil and soap industries would not have been successful on the opposite coast without the entrepreneurship of Lesvos, which contributed the technology for improving the olive mills and the know-how for distributing local products to Istanbul and beyond the borders of the Ottoman Empire. The geographical set of the region facilitated business interactions and mutual economic development. Experienced merchants and enterprises with far-flung branches geared towards exports exchanged information with landowners and merchants from Ayvalık and Edremit, bought quantities of olive oil for export for lightning purposes to Russia and the Balkans, and provided loans and other financial services, such as the cashing of bills of exchange. It should be said that the role of Asia Minor in the prosperity of Lesvos was no less dramatic. In 1850, following the catastrophic winter frost suffered by the olive groves of Lesvos, two varieties of trees, the Edremitan and the Kolovi, were transplanted from Asia Minor coast to the island. Therefore, the olive culture of Lesvos, after some years, recovered so successfully that it became a monoculture. Expertise in the economics of olive oil and its secrets enriched both sides. The cultivators of Asia Minor were more experienced in agricultural techniques and more adept at the care of the groves, which they tended with care rather than allowing them to grow without human intervention. Proper tilling and churning of the soil, fertilization and pruning were among the techniques brought by Greek Orthodox refugees to Lesvos from Asia Minor after 1922. Their expertise in cultivation was noted by the Mercantile and Industrial Chamber of Commerce of Lesbos in 1925, which acknowledged the refugees' contribution in the improvement of olive cultivation and olive oil production on the island. The unification of most of the islands of the Eastern Aegean with the Kingdom of Greece and the drawing of frontiers in the Aegean gradually cut off the economy of Lesbos from the hinterlands of Asia Minor. The negative changes that resulted were reflected in the merchants' correspondence. Interruption of transportation, disruption of postal services, prohibitions on the export of olive oil from Lesbos, and an import duty of 11% on the importation of soap from Lesbos to Turkey. Restrictions on trade resulting from the Italo-Turkish War of 1911, requisition of barrels of oil owned by Greek and foreign nationals in Asia Minor, and the closing of the branches of the Bank of Mytilene were among the difficulties faced by the merchants. All this led to the suspension of export business directed to the east and the search for alternative markets to the west. In contrast, in Asia Minor, the above events presented an opportunity for the development of local entrepreneurship. Muslim small businessmen devoted themselves to establishing olive presses and increased their production of soap to cover the shortage that resulted from the cessation of imports from Lesbos. In Lesbos, being cut off from the Asia Minor hinterland and the Ottoman economy created new, less favorable terms for its industry. The cost of transporting raw materials from continental Greece increased their price. The transportation of finished products from the now remote island to mainland Greece and Macedonia increased their cost. Soap making fell victim to the radical geopolitical changes. Taxation of white soap and the extraordinary taxes imposed on the region, unified with the Greek state following 1912, made the large-scale production of soap unprofitable. Yet, soap manufacturers stamped their products with Turkish labels and attempted to sell them in Turkey well into the 1930s. People adjusted slowly to the abrupt interruption of commercial ties and continued to hope for the quick resumption of normal communications and exchanges between the two neighboring shores. After many decades of poor communication, exchanges have empowered the local economies on both sides. Today, with the crisis affecting Greece, the increase in tourism from Turkey has resulted in a welcome infusion of money for the tattered local economies of the Aegean islands. The technical know-how of business and manufacturing compelled the businessmen of Lesbos to found industrial units outside the island in regions favorable to similar manufacturing activities. The first such location was Egypt, where immigration from Lesbos was of an intensely entrepreneurial nature. Crete and Piraeus followed. Plants for the extraction of olive kernel oil and cottonseed oil used the know-how of plants of olive kernel oil manufacturing. Skilled technicians and chemical engineers from the Asia Minor coast and the islands of Imbros and Tenedos also immigrated to Egypt. Others undertook the task of improving soap production in Asia Minor from adulterated low quality to high quality green, white, and scented soaps. Immigrants from both coasts to America brought eating habits and the technology of olive economics with them. They disseminated the sale of olive oil and the practice of cooking with it in America. On the coast of Asia Minor, as well as on the islands of the Aegean, the mastery of the economics of olive oil became a cultural resource which accompanied the immigrants on their wanderings. They had a reservoir of tacit knowledge which distinguished them, immigrants of the south, from those of the north. Olive oil was with them at the table and in the kitchen. Ladera recipes became a common dietary habit on both sides of the Aegean, but also in the countries where they settled. Today, in the post-industrial age, technical expertise in the steam-driven olive oil and soap production has become a cultural and educational project. Museums devoted to technologies related to the olive oil production have opened, and the historical buildings which once spawned the wealth of the region have been preserved or restored using the methods of industrial archaeology. The communal factory of Agia Paraskevy has been converted to the Museum of Olive Oil Production of the Piraeus Bank Group Cultural Foundation. It was inaugurated in 2006. It presents the industrial phase of olive oil production and has restored, in an exemplary way, the buildings and the mechanical equipment. Visitors and school groups can familiarize with the stages of olive oil production and how the factory evolved from steam power to diesel engine operation. In the storerooms for olives, you may discover the work cycle relating to the production of the olive oil, the cultivation and care of the olive tree, the production of subproducts, the marketing and distribution of olive oil in Greece and abroad, professions and activities linked to the production of olive oil. The museum organizes educational programs with games and activities, such as the program From the Olive to the Olive Oil, where the children acquire an understanding of the process of olive oil production at the factory and the carrying out of an acidimetry experiment. Another successful attempt is the Vranas Oil Press Museum at the village of Papados in Lesbos. Built in 1887, it belonged to Nikolaos Vranas, grandfather of the Nobel awarded poet Odysseas Elitis. It was restored and converted to a museum by the Archipelagos Cultural Society in 2009. It produces the Yea Vranas Olive Press Museum extra virgin olive oil. The oil comes from the wild olives variety, particular and unique to this corner of Greece, well known for the great quality olive oil it produces. The olive trees are exposed to the sun for more than 3,000 hours a year, allowing olives to acquire a distinctive and warm aroma and taste. The olives are picked one by hand and are immediately transferred to the olive mill. They are crushed under strict supervision so that the temperature does not exceed 19 degrees, ensuring that all the rich aromas and flavors are preserved from the olive to the oil. It is a harmonious and elegant taste, a bright green color, and an intense fruitiness due to its very low acidity level, which is circa 0.2%. Many industrial buildings of the island, with their characteristic architecture, have been renovated into cultural centers, hotels, exhibitions, spaces, and even contemporary facilities for the production of olive oil. These two are homages to the culture of the oil. So I would like to finish my speech with a 2-minute video from the transformation of the abandoned Vranas factory to the Vranas Olive Press Museum. So I'll just turn this off and see. Για να δούμε αν θα το καταφέρουμε. So it says that steadily all things survive in the contemporary ones. Πώς το μεγαλώσουμε, εδώ. Πώς.
Όχι, όχι, δεν είναι εκείνο. Είναι το καλώδιο έχει πρόβλημα.
Και τι να πατήσουμε.
Σαν τραγίδα αρχιστέα.
Αυτά όμως δεν το παίρνει.
Το κλείσατε.
Το κλεισά. Το ξανανοίξουμε. Just a second. Εδώ. Εδώ. Εδώ.
Όχι.
Θα πάει.
Το δω.
Thank you very much.
My dearest Rura, thank you. Thank you very much for this interesting travel to the North Aegean. We see the both sides of this area with a common culture, with the common product, olive oil. Thank you, my dear. I have to say that Rura Sifnaios, Evridiki Sifnaios, works very hard for the heritage of his birthplace. Thank you, Riritsa. Şey başlıyor, discussion. Soru varsa sorabilirsiniz.
You can ask your questions if you have any question. We are waiting for your questions if you have any. Well, obviously, we don't have any question.
We do.
Can you hear me? I would like to ask Ms. Evridiki one question. You said the kernel oil. So is it a different method of production than the olive oil production? Because I have a family enterprise in northern Ege, or northern Aegean in Saros Gulf. We are producing olive oil, and I was wondering about this production method in terms of kernel oil. Is there a different technique?
Yes. Now, olive kernel oil produces green soap. And the plant is much greater than the olive press, the olive mill. Even if it's mechanized. And the raw material, which is used for the extraction of olive kernel oil, are the kernels. So this is a practice that, at least in the island of Lesbos, it began to operate at the end of the 19th century. And just to give the size of the enterprises, we had, at the beginning of the 20th century, about 113 mechanized olive factories, and we had 5 olive kernel oil factories. Okay?
Teşekkür ederim.
Merhaba, Aytaç Demirci, Boğaziçi Üniversitesi.
I am Artaç Demirci from Bosphorus University, Boğaziçi University. I would like to ask a question to the floor. Mr. Mehmet spoke about the milestones, historical milestones before he started his speech. He spoke about 1920s and 1930s, and of course you said that there were some changes depending on the relations between nature and economy. The production decreased because of the weather conditions, and there were some regulations, and I think there were changes in the production methods. And did you take any measures? Because in 1920s new machineries were developed, and the production methods also changed. Can we say that new steps were taken? Sorry, he could not hear you.
O zaman kısaca tekrarlayayım.
Then I will repeat it.
Üretim biçiminin değişmesiyle
As the production method changed,
mesela sunumda baktığınız doğa
please come closer because I cannot hear you.
öyle mi? Tamam, peki pardon. Şimdi mesela sizin sorunuzda hani bazı dönüm noktaları verdiniz tarih.
Well, you have given us some milestones within history,
Ve sabun üretimine dair
and
alınan bazı önlemler
you said there were some precautions that were taken with respect to olive oil and soap production, and
bakılarak alınan önlemler var.
there were some precautions that were taken depending on the weather conditions. For example, there was a very severe winter and the government took actions. But with respect to transformation of production methods, Did you come across any measure? Does it apply to olive or soap?
üretim biçiminin dönüşmesiyle ilgili
Because
olarak ne söyleyebilirsiniz?
what else can you tell us
Yaratmanızda öyle bir çizelge görebildiniz mi?
about the change of production methods,
Yani mekanizasyonu da düşünerek yani
considering mechanizing as well?
Üretim ilişkilerinde değişme benim
Well, the change and transformation of
daha sonra söz konusudur. 19. yüzyılın
Actually,
ortalarından sonra sözünü ettiğiniz üretim biçiminde değişme vardır. Osmanlı sistemi
the production method changed in the classical system starting from 16th century to the end of 18th century. The production relations,
ne tür bir ilişkiydi? Bir kere
what kind of a relation was it? It was not a capitalist
olarak feodal bir ilişki de değildi.
relation, or it was not a feudal relation. Marx was not born in Turkey, so the Asian type of production method, it was not relevant to Ottoman. Feudal and capitalistic elements were present, and it was a sui generis Ottoman relation. These relations
50'lerden sonra başladı,
were capitalized after
devam etti.
1850s, and it lasted for 100 years to become capitalist.
Üretimiyle, sabun üretimiyle
And
fazla, yani benim anlattığım dönem bakımından
it is not relevant to olive oil production. It is not different from the period I mentioned.
yani şu duyulabiliyorsa böyle
Can you hear me?
duyulabiliyor mu şu anda? Duyabiliyor musunuz?
duyuyorum
Tamam.
şimdi. Evet.
Üretim araçlarında bir dönüşüm var ama
And there is a transformation in the production tools, right? Because
bir değişiklik var. Bir
the transformation of the production tools. Yes, it also happened in
ne kadar sonra? Yani nasıl bir
that century. What kind of a transformation? Because the production tools also changed. The stone mills were not present then. Because you said we are talking about a technological production, but it was not sudden. It took 200 years, I think, and there were some technological advancements.
Bana soruyorsunuz. Yok yani genel soruyorsunuz. Evet. Bu teknolojinin değişmesi de çok hızlı.
The change of technology, it was not very quick, it was slow indeed, and it took a very long time. Assume that
Mesela buhar makinesi
the steam machine
1800'lerden sonra kullanıldı.
was used in transportation after 19th century in the maritime transportation. The first steam engine ships came after that, and they survived with their regular boats for 150 years. Between 1880 and 1890, the dominant technology was steam. In 1870, 60% of the ships were regular ones.
Çok bilinen ve basit bir alandan örnek veriyorum.
60% of them were sailboats. And the technological change did not occur that quickly.
Ambalaj konusunda öğrenmek istediklerim.
I want to learn about packaging because in the first ages,
Zeytin ticareti
the olive trading was very high.
Hakikaten duyamıyorum.
I cannot hear you.
Yüksek sesle.
Evet, size yapılan
Please
sorumu da cevap
closer. Miss Emelico can also answer. I was wondering about the packaging.
dediğimiz kaplarla yapılıyordu değil mi?
The transportation was done in amphora. The containers called amphora. I think I will not hear with that either.
Ben zeytin ticaretinin Alo. Tamam. Evet. Sesim geliyor mu?
Can you hear me now?
Tamam. Şimdi zeytin ticareti ilk çağlardan bu yana yapılıyor.
Olive trading has been done for a very long time,
Oluşumunu etkiledi.
and it also affected the civilization, and the fundamental requirements of the human beings were met with olive. And the first trading was done with the containers called amphora. But I was wondering about its development. Maybe you or Miss Evridiki could answer. When did they start to use the cans?
Ama o büyük
Or they were trading with amphoras in 16th or 17th century?
ne zaman
When did they use the cans first?
daha kolay bir şekilde bu
And
bu ambalaj
when did they start using
gelişimi nasıl oldu?
the packaging in an easier way? I would like to learn as well, because I have no answer to your question. I wish I could also know about it, but maybe Miss Evridiki could answer.
Bir şeyler söyleyecektim. Yani şu anda kullandığımız tenekeler
The cans that we are using currently, were they present in 16th or 17th century? Could you? Felix and Bourgeois were French consuls,
diye bir kitabı var.
and they have a book.
187
It was
17 anlatıyor.
it's describing 10 years from 1787 to 1797, and he describes it very detailed. The olives produced in Mora are transported, and he's talking about barrels,
Bilmezler Marsilya'dan ithal eder.
and he says the barrels were imported from Marseille. That's all I know of. Thank you.
Okay. I would like to understand, we are talking about the transportation of the olive oil from the olive mill and the storage of the olive oil.
Yes, I'm talking about it's
saklama yöntemleri. Yani
the storage methods used in the international trading.
So
amforalar
As far as I'm concerned, they were stored in amphoras. How long did they use amphoras, and when did they start using the cans, or which methods did they use to facilitate the trading of olive?
yes. Now, from the 18th century and until the beginning of the 20th century, for the storage of olive oil, we have basically the big ceramic jars. The ones we use in Italy are the ones which are produced in Asia Minor in the Çanakkale area. Also, for the storage, we use the iron reservoirs. But this is after the 1850s. And for the transportation of olive oil from the olive mills, the most common way of transporting it was in the skin of animals, okay, animal hides. And then we also had the tin bottles, let's say, big bottles, Yes, teneke, that would take about 16 kilos of olive oil. But they could contain 16 kilos of olive oil.
Çok teşekkürler.
First of all, I would like to thank both speakers for their fascinating presentations. And as a passionate consumer of olive oil products with hardly any knowledge of the production, and today this knowledge was, of course, enriched to some degree, I would have a question to the second speaker. You mentioned the sophisticated techniques of trimming olive trees on the Asia Minor side of the Aegean, and later on you spoke about the wild olive trees of the island of Lesbos. And I was wondering, for what purpose is the trimming done? Is it to enlarge the quantities of oil, or does it enrich the flavor of the olives that are harvested? So where do you get the better olives? From the wild trees or from the more sophisticated trimmed trees?
Oh, this is a huge question because you mentioned the factor quality. So in the contemporary production, quality of the olive oil depends basically on how quickly we can collect the olives immediately from the tree. And let's say that in our regions, we are quite handicapped because the variety of trees we have are very high. And by contrast, in the Peloponnese, they have very low trees. And this makes the cost of production much cheaper. So what they are trying to do, the producers today, is try to reduce the height of the trees, although they are quite high, in order to lower the cost of production. So first of all, it depends, now the quality first of all depends when you are going to collect your olives. Secondly, it depends where is the olive grove, how many hours per day the sun affects the olives, what is the microclimate of the region. The third thing is the process of extraction of the olive, if you're using the cold pressing or if you are mixing your pulp with boiled water. So let's say the three basic things. But anyway, the heritage we have of the trees, the heritage of the trees is quite, it is not in favor of the quality of the olive oil in our region. It needs a lot of money to produce a good quality of olive oil.
My question is for Professor Mehmet. You can hear me, right? Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you for your great presentation. I would like to ask,
Merkez halkın tüketim amaçlı kullandığı zeytin, sabun ve yağ ya da saray. Ege dışında kayıtlarda Güneydoğu'dan hiç
is there any olive oil or soap that comes to Istanbul from southeast? And if you have come across them, can you give us some examples about the names of the merchants? Thank you. I cannot give you so much details, but until Crete joined the Ottoman lands, soap was coming from Syria, Trablus soap, and most probably olive oil was also coming from there. Actually, they were not consuming olive oil too much. In 18th and 19th century,
İstanbul'un %40'a yakını
almost 40% of Istanbul were Greek, and they were consuming olive oil, of course. But the Muslims were not consuming olive oil. For example, in the palace, they were not consuming any olive oil. And the Muslim population of Istanbul were using olive oil for lighting. And that's why I spoke about candle. When candle became more expensive, they chose candle because it was more lighting. And after 19th century, they started consuming olive oil as a food. And there is a formula used in history of economics.
insan ne yiyor?
It means you are what you eat.
Türkler
And the Greeks and Turks
sonundan itibaren aynı şeyi yiyerek
started to eat the same thing after 19th century. That's why we resemble each other.
Merhaba, teşekkür ederim ikinize.
Well, thank you for your presentations.
Değerli bilgileriniz için. Geçmişteki durumdan bahsettiniz de.
You have spoken about olive oil, and how it developed in the history, and I have a question about today.
Bildiğiniz gibi
As you know,
öğreticilerin üzerinde bugün bir
and there is a huge pressure in our country on the olive and olive oil producers.
durum hakkında ne
And
düşünüyorsunuz?
what about the other side? And what do you think about our country's condition?
benim bu konuda maalesef bilgim yok.
Unfortunately, I am not knowledgeable about this. I am sure that I do not know more than you.
Bir tanesi
Actually,
savaşmadı ama
I think it was not enacted yet, but there is a draft law which says
zeytin alanı
small lands of olive
ciler için sanırım
will not be considered as olive lands, and I don't want to touch upon politics, but they will be using these small lands for mining because they will not be considered as lands of olive. And there are also gold mines on Kaz Mountains. I mean, it is impacted by the mining a lot. And what about the situation on the other side of Aegean? I am not informed about it. What about your country? Do you have such threats or conditions in your country?
We do not have olive groves in regions where we have mine production, which is normally it's more profitable. So the political choices will be backing the mining enterprise. But since you mentioned the small size of the olive grove, it is not a matter of competition between, let's say, Turkish and Greek olive producers. The problem is, it's a more general problem, it's a world problem, and the problem is that the small olive size of the olive farms, it is very difficult to compete on a European or on a global level with the great olive grove fields we have, for example, in Spain, in Italy, where we have a concentration of the production and a concentration of the extraction plants. And in these countries, this is how they can achieve very low prices. So the small farms, it's difficult to compete with the large farms. But unfortunately, this year, since the Spanish production, from what they say, it has been destroyed, I think that most probably the Turkish and the Greek farmers have many more possibilities to sell their products on the global market.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rura, Mehmet. Thank you very much for your speaking, speeches. Thank you, everybody. We wait you in the next future year. I wish you to everybody a very happy new year. Okay.
Felicitations.